Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to all the participants who joined us on today's session. Today's session topic is Safeguarding National Interests in the Future of Cloud Computing. I'm Gautam Karthik. I work as a regional manager for a company called Crossbow Labs. Crossbow Labs specializes in cybersecurity consulting, compliance audits, and regulatory audits, and also provides ancillary support services such as testing, SOC monitoring, training on information security, and so forth. I work as a regional manager for business development and strategy in the CEMEA region, and I have a cumulative experience of about 12 years in the information technology industry. To set the context on what we're going to be talking about today in the presentation, we see that there is an increased dependence on cloud storage platforms to store data which is sensitive, private, and confidential. Gone are the days where traditional infrastructure played a major role in data storage. More and more entities are depending upon the on demand services and the flexibility offered by the cloud computing platform. Incidentally, the data that is getting stored here pertains to a lot of individuals and it is of sensitive and private in nature. Now, with that, there is an increased dependency on the protection and privacy components, and more countries want to safeguard their national interest on how this data is perceived and how it is going to be used. Some of the controls that they're talking about, which we would be seeing in this presentation, is data localization. Now, with data localization, what countries try to achieve is establish a set of control and establish certain guidelines for all the practitioners to follow. Now, with the introduction of this concept and with countries' prerogatives to save and protect the citizens' data, how does this affect the ecosystem? Does it stress the ecosystem, which is made up of cloud service providers, cloud consumers, and organizations who want to develop their business by relying on such technologies? What kind of technical inhibitors does this put? Because some of the offerings which are offered by the service providers currently is very regional. The same technology may not be available in different regions, and hence that could prove as a deterrent. And does it also prove to be a deterrent for startups which try to leverage the flexibility and advantages, whether it is financial or technological, provided by such cloud service providers to enhance their business? So we would be looking at what is the growing interest with countries and how they go about protecting the privacy and security of the citizens' data. This would be the primary objective which countries are following currently to safeguard their national interest, and what will be the methodology through which they are controlling this data set. Once we look at that, we would be moving on to what kind of challenges the ecosystem faces by the advent of data localization regulation, which countries might introduce. And post that, we would be looking at a few recommendations on how the data localization policy adherence can be taken care of while also taking care of the advantages provided by cloud computing is leveraged to the maximum benefit of businesses across the world. So that's how we have structured the presentation today. So we will get started with why do nations and governments interest in saving this data and protecting it. Now, this data set is very endemic to the region and this is collected from the citizens. It could be any type of data, financial, regulatory, healthcare related, anything which is personally identifiable to a citizen or a national residing in the particular country. Now, a lot of these countries use this data set to generate insights by running a lot of analysis on top of the data set. It could be key in identifying the growth factors and indicators which govern how an economy is progressing and what are the factors that a government should be focusing on in order to better its position in the society and in the future. Hence, there is a greater impact to store and protect this information with all the privacy and confidentiality that they want to be surrounding this data set. Some of the usages which governments use this data for, and some of the industries with which this data set is associated, we have seen this. It could be from security or law enforcement, it could be research and development, it could be economic growth factors, it could be the identification the indicators which show where the country stands vis-a-vis the current economic status. More importantly, it can also help the government to decide and baseline the policies, benefits, and practices that they want to be enforcing upon the citizens so that it could be protected in a safe way and also the national interest can be protected. Now, we saw that it is very critical data that is being collected belonging to these citizens, and it could be personally identifiable and sensitive. Now, with any data set that is collected, the ownership for such a data would reside with the government or the service element, service industry which is collecting this entity information to work for the business model. So they would be responsible to save this information not only to protect the identity of the citizen but also to prevent malicious individuals and foreign surveillance to get hold of this information which a country might treat as sensitive information which it does not want to share with the rest of the operations in the world. So this will also help the government and regulators to provide jurisdiction of the data. Of late, we see that a country operating in a remote corner of the world could store this data on any other location in the world, and that's the advantage digitization and cloud service providers, provide to the industry. Now, with that being said, how much of this control can be retailed by the countries is a question that is debated a lot, and data localization is one such method which is given a way for countries and regulators to hold the jurisdiction on top of the data and make sure that their intent is met at times. So, to make sure privacy and security of data is primordial, and also to make sure that the data jurisdiction resides with them for the data set that they've identified as critical. This is the key intent which countries indicate in protecting the national interest and the data of their own citizens. Some countries have taken a leaf out of this. They've already gone ahead and implemented. We would have all seen this across different walks of our life. The data that they're collecting from the citizens is centralized, and by virtue of centralizing this, they're able to deliver all the umbrella suite of services that they offer, the benefits from one central location. And gone are the days where, as a citizen, you will have to go stand in a public sector office in order for you to perform a obligation or a duty to the government as per law, or for you to receive the benefits that the government has devised for the citizens to receive. So now it is all seamlessly translated onto a digital platform. And by virtue of a single identifier which is unique to a citizen can log into these services and can avail from a range of services or infrastructure, key infrastructure services that the government offers to its citizens, whether it is infrastructure like utilities, or whether it is about availing healthcare support, or is it about taxation, it could be from law enforcement as well. So all of these services are brought upon a central platform from which these citizens can leverage and utilize them to the maximum benefit. So these are some of the advantages which countries face by bringing their services online, and it has helped them to take their services that much more seamlessly across to their citizens. Now, this information which belongs to citizens is very critical that we have seen that in the last few slides. And how do countries retain control of this data? Because some of these data sets may not directly belong to the country's public sector firms working on it. It could also have a mix of private sector service providers working on top of it, and which means they will have to have a central policy or a method to control the data jurisdiction and the privacy regulations that they want to enforce on this data set. So the solution that most of the countries have come up with is data localization. Data localization law is nothing but any data which pertains to a particular citizen, if it is collected and processed, it has to be stored within the boundaries of a country. It cannot be transmitted outside of the country's border across international lines unless there is a definite policy which allows it to do so, and having the local data localization and privacy laws being met That will be the first condition. And the second condition would be a definite consent mechanism being established so that the data which is being transferred is intimated to the end user, stating that this is the purpose for which the data is being transmitted from A location to location B, and a clear retention period should be enforced for all such data. So data localization is all about establishing control and jurisdiction over the data and making sure that there are no regional conflicts when it comes to which kind of laws will apply and govern the data privacy and security. So the objectives like we just spoke about, regulators and countries are looking to maintain a set of security control and measures in order to regulate the privacy which is enforced on top of the data. They are trying to establish the accountability of user data so that there is no regional conflicts. Similarly, they also want to hold jurisdiction where a country will have the control to call back a set of data if it deems necessary, and there are no regional conflicts or the legal conflicts which could arise from the data being stored potentially outside of the country's boundary. So these are the main objectives of data localization. We'll now see how some of the countries have adopted to it and who are some of the leading adopters for data localization. Like as you can see on the slide, there are a few countries which have adopted data localization as a method in which they want to regulate the control over the data set of its citizens. Now, a point to be kept in mind here is not all countries have a similar data localization policy. There is a very different approach each country has adopted. This stems from the new age adage where data is considered as the new oil. It is valuable, establishing themselves setting up a way to progress in the modern economy. So, data privacy has never been more critical to countries, and especially when it pertains to the citizens' data. Now, each country has identified a particular data set as being very important to it, and they want to go ahead with, adopting a methodology in which they can safeguard it. Like, for example, in Russia, which is very similar to GDPR of UK, they've established a data localization policy by virtue of which all the personal data which belong to the citizens will have to be stored within the country's boundary. Any service provider or entity which is handling any such information cannot take this information and store it outside of Russian boundary. Whereas in India, they've identified payment related card information and transaction information as critical to them, and they want all their service providers and operations from businesses to store this information only within their boundary and not take it outside. They have different regulatory bodies which govern such actions. For India, it is the Reserve Bank of India which governs uh, the governance process with respect to data privacy and localization. Whereas some of the countries have a more broader approach where they have a way in which they can pull the entire data set of the citizens under the data localization policy. Now, while there are a lot of these countries which support data localization and have gone about in implementing it, we have also seen that there are countries like US where there are big corporate giant companies like Google, Mastercard, Visa, and these companies thrive on a central model in which data is not restricted by data localization policy, but rather they advocate for a free flow of data. Now, what happens is there is a conflict of interest with respect to data localization policy and data free flow without a border. One comes from the concern to protect information and safeguard national interest, and one stems from the concern to propagate business into a more global model and bring a sustainable model in which all entities can leverage on data being freely available for analysis and build their own business models based on it. We will look at a way in which these can coexist and data localization interests can be protected while leveraging the advantages of a wide distributed model. We will look at it at the penultimate section of this presentation once we have gone past what are the challenges that the industry is facing. In this slide, we are going to just have a sneak peek of what the countries have implemented and how they've gone about it. Like we have said, all countries do not presume that all information is important to them. It depends on what they're trying to protect. They could have multiple data localization policies as well, specific to each sector of information that they want to be protecting. For example, Germany in 2005 had a localization policy by which all telecommunication companies and ISP providers were required to hold the information only, store the information only within the country. Russia, like we spoke about, concerns all of personal data belong to Russian citizens. India covered about payment related data, and United Arab Emirates in 2019 decided that healthcare related information cannot be transmitted outside the country. So they have their own reasons and the national interest that they are protecting through all of this information. The reason that most of these countries have come across could stem from multiple factors. We will just look at one example to identify some of the common challenges that is prevalent in a dynamic and distributed model that a cloud service platform could provide to its end consumers. Let's assume that a company A is set up in a GCC country, and the company A handles a data type which belongs to the citizens of country in the GCC. Now, this information is sensitive and it has to be protected. And company A is not depending on any physical infrastructure, and they're going to put up this service on a cloud service provider who's registered in a different part of the world and has a physical data center, let's say in Asian region where this data is going to be stored. Now, if there is a case of a conflict between company A and the cloud service provider, which could stem from either a data breach or a failure of service or a denial of service or a breach of contract, for example, what will be the challenges that this throws up in such an ecosystem? Now, the first question that arises in the mind is which country's laws would apply? Or the laws pertaining to a GCC country hold over the dispute resolution, or the laws of an Asian country where it is stored being considered? Now, even if there is a definite way in which this can be demarked, there is no way that a cloud user could clearly define what is the loss to business that he has suffered or what kind of damage he has suffered. Because of the distributed nature, the data is not residing in one single location, and also the perceived value of this data could also define once it is being transferred across different geographies. Because of which there could not be a clear cut way in which a cloud user can demonstrate it. Even, let's say, for example, in the UAE Court of Law, there is a code number 5 of 1985 which says cloud user will have to prove. And in case the region of jurisdiction is identified as UAE, and they agree that the court, the judicial authorities will belong to UAE and they will prosecute this charge of breach in contract or so forth. There is no clear way where a UAE court can evaluate the loss of business stemming from an effect which is happening in either Brunei or in India. Similarly, if you think that the neutral governing body for this is UAE and the charges are being heard in this court of law, the UAE Federal Law number 2 of 2006, there is a definition for identifying the criminal nature that is permeated by a malicious individual through a data breach. But now there is no legal decree or law right now which defines how a cloud service provider will have to be processed if there is a data breach stemming from his services or there is a breach of contract. Though there could be a very long document of SLA and service contract which could be interpreted from different judicial bodies, there is no clear defined way in which they have to be prosecuted, especially even more if it is the case of a service provider operating in a different country of jurisdiction and origin. So, with the diversity and the advantage that the cloud service provider offers, it also brings a set of challenges which a cloud service provider or a cloud consumer faces, and more so from the view of a regulatory body or a judiciary body which is expected to analyze and understand what could be the breach or loss of impact to business that it perpetrates from such a scenario. So, with these being said, data localization is a policy by which countries will retain control of the data set which they think is critical and want to be protected, and there is no transfer of data which happens uh, without satisfying the preliminary conditions of data localization policy, by which case some of these challenges would be addressed already, and there would be a way in which there would be a definite approach for. Hello. Hello.
Karthi, in the mic, I think you put it on your desk, is it? Because what we are able to see, it's muffled. The voice is muffled for the last 2 minutes or so.
Okay, it suddenly changed because I didn't move the cursor at all. Because நீ பாத்தீங்கல்ல, I have not touched the mouse pad at all. It is
Yeah,
just
I
there
know.
in
Mouse
share
pad இல்ல,
screen.
mic சொல்றேன் நான்.
இல்ல, it has been there without. இல்ல, will it make sense if I wear headphones? I can wear headphones.
Yeah, I think so. Can we try that right like that right now? We'll see how it works.
Okay. ஓகே, அது வந்து இப்போ நீங்க கால் பண்ணும்போதுல இருந்தா இல்ல முன்னாடில இருந்தே போயிடுச்சா? பிகாஸ் நவ் ஐ கிளிக்ட். ஓகே, ஓகே. இன்ஃபேக்ட் நான் வந்து அந்த ஈவன் தோ த ஸ்லைட் இஸ் தேர் ஆன் டாப், என்ன ஆச்சுன்னா இப்போ இவங்க வந்து தேவ் கிவன் அ பிபிடி டு அஸ் விச் டஸ் நாட் ஹாவ் ப்ரெசென்டர் நோட்ஸ் இன் இட், தேவ் சேஞ்ச்ட் இட். இப்போ எங்கள் ஸ்க்ரீனில் நீங்கள் பார்க்குறது வந்து இஸ் ஜஸ்ட் த பிபிடி. வெயிட், லெட் மீ. ஆமாம், தேவ். ஓகே, சரி, அதுலேயும் இருக்குது. சரி, ஓகே. இல்லை, தேவ் நாட் டச் த ப்ரெசென்டர் நோட், சாரி. ம், இல்லை. அதான். இல்லை. ஆ ஆ இருக்கு 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 மைக் இருக்கு. யா, ஓகே, உள்ளே தான் இருக்குது. ஒன் செகண்ட், ஒன் செகண்ட். ஆக்சுவலாக அது இன்னும் பிரிக்கல, இந்த மைக்கில் கேட்குதுன்றதுனால இதுலேயே ட்ரை பண்ணிட்டேன். ஒன் செகண்ட், ஜஸ்ட் கேட்டேன்.
அப்புறம் அந்த ஆம்பியன்ஸ் சவுண்ட்னு சொல்லுவாங்க. ஸோ அது கொஞ்சம் ஜாஸ்தியா இருக்கும். Some paper moving or click and all of that.
சரி, ஓகே. But there is a lag still, right? After I speak,
the lag will be there. Yeah, because YouTube wants to buffer the live broadcast and then put it so that there is no discontinuity in the broadcast.
Okay.
Okay, அதுக்கப்புறம் லாங்குவேஜ் ரிலேட்டட் பாயிண்ட் ரெண்டு இருக்கு. லாங்குவேஜ்னா இட்ஸ் த ஃப்ளோ இஸ் ரியலி குட் மேன். த ஃப்ளோ இஸ் லைக் சூப்பர் குட். எனர்ஜி கொஞ்சம் ஆம்ப் அப் பண்ணணும்னு நினைக்கிறேன் in terms of just being more vocal about it. I'm sure tomorrow on the event excitement la அது ஆட்டோமேட்டிக்கா வந்துரும். That's all. ரொம்பலாம் பண்ண வேண்டாம், பட் ஆனா just a small notch.
Okay.
And 2 points I noted was in the countries in remote corner of the world, countries which other in the all these what we want to say la adu konjam careful, rather than saying corners or small countries or something, all countries can be more inclusive. And the madri we have to say developing countries will find it more easier to do these things, the agnostic language when you use pannuvom.
Okay.
Oh, that's the only one. Second one is he or she. It is not very critical, but just so you want to make it neutral, you can say they.
Okay.
Right? Suppose a person is doing this, then they have to do this. You get it, right? He or she, because it's a kind of a thing. It's not very
இல்ல
very.
எங்க எந்த பாயிண்ட்ல தே சொல்றீங்க புரியல.
I just noted down the point. I forgot to note which slide.
Okay, okay. இல்ல நான்
the point went some.
Okay.
The point went something like. So imagine if he wants to do this activity of getting the data, then he will be able to directly access it through this particular data center, and the localization will happen on the very areas. So just focus it all on. Just keep a tab on it at the back of your head. What will happen when you speak
saying
is
we'll use he
you'll
or
automatically
she and
realize.
not they. That's what you're saying, right? You're saying use he or she and not they.
No, I'm saying use they and not he or she.
Okay.
Okay. We have to very compulsorily use they more neutral languages or say he or she once in a while, so they know that it's not. This is not a very critical thing, but just keep a tab on it. The other one is if you have the and the energy component has to kuncho notch up panno.
Okay.
You get it, right? So you'll be able to simply escalate on top of it. Easy on.
Okay.
Okay. Idla source maatrama in the mic pottada illa is it already?
I connected, but Teams la kuda in fact indula தான் வாய்ஸ் வருதே தவிர அது வந்து வரல.
இல்ல நீ இதுல நீ வந்து OBS ல பண்ணனும்னு நினைக்கிறேன். Can you get to OBS?
ஆடியோவே
அதுல வந்து
ஆடியோவே வரலையே. See, but இந்த headphones connect பண்ணா கேக்குது. ஒரே நிமிஷம் இருங்க. See this.
Okay.
Now the audio source has changed and I'm speaking through the headphones. Your voice also coming through the headphones. Idhil avla. I'm not sure why it is not reading. Okay. Yeah, I'm just testing this mic for audio source. I'm able to hear you clearly. Okay. For the other microphone சொல்றீங்க. Okay.
Logitech HD340 something like that. No, so just to when you do a command space, go to sound and choose the input mode as the mic of the headphone that you use.
Okay. Wait 1 second. Will it be here itself?
You remove the microphone. Otherwise, this will too many input sources இருக்கும்.
இல்ல அந்த microphone கட்டிட்டேன். This one I have removed already.
Okay.
Logitech மட்டும் தான் போட்டுருக்கேன். I removed it. But the mic is showing like I'm speaking. OBS la வந்து காட்டுது. As in like this mic is running right and left பாருங்க. Or is it just testing? I'm not sure.
Okay, do me a favor. There is a little bit of lag, so there maybe what I'm seeing on screen is just go to sound.
Internal USB.
Now it's so much better. Sorry.
I'm using this mic only. I'm not on direct, but I'm not sure if it is directly taking from the micro or.
I can, since I'm speaking on Teams, I can visually. I mean, I can orally listen to it clearly.
Okay.
So now what we'll do is we'll close Teams maybe.
But your voice is coming.
Just remember.
But your voice is coming from my external. Okay.
That's what.
Now I've changed it. Yeah. I think I got it. Yeah. Okay.
This mic is so much better than yours.
Okay.
Okay, so let's start.
அப்படியா?
Take action.
Okay, sorry. I'll just see where I stopped. Okay.
Okay, take action. Take 2 action.
Okay, I'll take from where I stopped.
I'll drop the Teams now.
Yeah. Bye. So carrying on from where we stopped, we are now going to look at what are some of the concerns that revolves around data localization. When we say concerns, we are going to be talking about what the players in the market are going to be facing. We are going to be talking about what a cloud consumer will have to take care of from his end when data localization is in the play. And then we are going to be looking at how some of the service providers in the market have structured their offering and how they go about delivering their services. So what kind of challenges they face in such a diverse environment with data localization coming into the picture. After we cover this, we will go about and look at what some of the recommendations are for bringing these two together to bring synergy into the market. Now, these are some of the giants in the market that we already know of. We're talking about Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, and they have provided services across a large large section of the world, covering multiple geographies in terms of their service offerings and technology offerings that they provide to end consumers to build their business model. They not only cater to big businesses, they also cater to a lot of small businesses. So we are going to be looking at some of the ways in which an end user who is utilizing the services from a cloud service provider like Amazon or Microsoft will have to cover when it comes to data localization. Now we will take a couple of examples in the interest of understanding. Now AWS has massive coverage across the world. They cover about 22 geographic regions and about 69 availability zones. Before we proceed, I'll just briefly explain what is a region and what is a availability zone as per Amazon. A lot of you might already know this. A region is nothing but a cluster of data centers that have been established in a particular region to provide the services. Now, when we say region, we are not only limited to a particular country. It is decided by Amazon as to what comprises a region. It could be a cluster of countries or geographically identified portion of the globe in which they are offering these services. And availability zones are nothing but a subset of these regions. And these availability zones are nothing but isolated data centers through which the service providers are offering these services in that region. Now, there is a dual responsibility when it comes to availability zones. They help with business continuity and offering disaster recovery, and not only that, they also help in cloud service providers to offer high data resiliency availability to all the consumers and make sure that their service offerings can be leveraged to the best of technology advancements that they have implemented. How they go about is illustrated in the diagram that you can see on the screen. A region can have any number of availability zones. Generally, it is anywhere from 3 to 5, and it depends on how big of a geography they are covering and what are the services and technology offerings that they have. And generally, the availability zones are slightly physically distanced by about 300 miles or so. It depends on how they want to bring up this region so that environmental factors do not come and play a role in denial of service. In the Middle East, it is structured with a region set up in Manama, Bahrain, and it is supported by 3 availability zones, one in Dubai, UAE, one in Fujairah, UAE, and then one in Tel Aviv, Israel. So as you can see from the spread, they've gone about identifying critical areas through which they can bring a distributed architecture into a central model to offer these services. Now, as we move on to Microsoft, we are talking about a similar model, slightly different in the way they've architected the solution though. They also cover about 60 plus regions around the world, and instead of a region and availability zone, they operate as a region pair. Now, what is a region pair? Like for example, if they're setting up an operation point in the Middle East, they would go about, and this is something that they already have, UAE North based out of Dubai and UAE Central based out of Abu Dhabi. So what happens in this scenario is region 1 and 2 act as primary and secondary, and in case primary goes down, the secondary comes up and offers the services, and vice versa. So they've established the continuity and disaster recovery and high availability by this architecture, by which one region acts as a fail-safe and fallback for the other region, and a lot of regions come together in order to take Microsoft offerings to the world. So predominantly most of the service providers have such a model. As you can see clearly from this, there are some challenges which data localization will throw upon such a service provider who has to hold physical installations and create a lot of backup installations in order to support the services. And we will have to also keep in mind that some of the technology offerings from these service providers is not uniform across all regions. When we cover some of the challenges that a cloud user face, this will come into the light more clearly to us. We will cover that. I just wanted to make a note at this point. Some of the challenges that the service providers face at this point of time would be operational, legal and jurisdictional, and financial. Now, as we can see, they have set up a central distribution model through which they can cater to multiple sections of the market and not bound themselves to one single region from a single data center. Now, for setting up one particular region of service, they also go about setting up multiple data centers. With data localization in picture, if the users from that region are governed by local policies by which the data cannot be sent outside of the local border, in order to cater such customers, a service provider will have to set up local installations in each legal region. Thereby, the number of physical installations that they'll have to maintain will multiply X numbers, and associated financial costs in order to maintain it, in order to install it, in order to get the necessary resources allocated, in order to train these resources, and to bring upon the technology components to ensure seamless service multiplies that much more. Also, there is a legal and jurisdictional conflict which happens when the data from one particular region, let's say from India, is getting stored in the GCC. Now, as we see, the data localization policy in India states that payment related information will have to be stored within the country. If one of the service providers who's handling the payment information wants to put their information here, then there is a clear legal and jurisdictional issue with respect to how the data privacy is secured, and also the data retention policies across these two countries could be very different, in which case the service provider will have to have multiple sets of approaches in which he can address all these issues faced, thereby increasing his cost. And the advantages that a cloud service provider offers in terms of on-demand facilities or cost efficient optimized ways in which they can leverage cloud services, they get challenged a little in such an environment where policies and regulations will become a guiding force in choosing service rather than the technology advancements and the efficiency which a business model can provide. So a service provider will have to undergo a lot of revamp on his infrastructure, his policies, his way of approach to offering service in a country as per the data localization policy prevalent in that country. Now, as we move to the other side of the spectrum, we are talking about the cloud users who will utilize these cloud resources in order to bring up their business model. There are three main areas that they will have to keep their focus on. One is data location, one is data ownership, and the third one is data retention period. As we can see, data location becomes very important with data localization in the picture. The service providers cannot take this information outside of the jurisdictional country for the business model unless there is a consent mechanism, and even with the consent mechanism, the local policies will have to be adhered to. So as a cloud user, you will have to be very cautious about what are the applicable regulations and data localization policies that an end user will have to comply with in order to safeguard the security and also ensure privacy. And they will also have to keep track of the user consent and make sure that the end users are informed of the purpose and the intent and the retention period. Data ownership. Now, with a lot of this data being stored on the cloud, and if there is a conflict of interest where there is a data breach or a service contract breach, now who owns the data that is being stored up? It's almost always the consumer who uploads the data, who is the custodian of this information. But in cases where the data is getting stored in different locations, there should be a clear definition on who's responsible and accountable for the data. There should be a clear responsibility matrix, especially if a cloud user is going to be utilizing the services offered by a cloud service provider on top of his data set. Example would be a data monitoring service or an ancillary service or an analysis service which a cloud service provider can offer to its cloud users, by virtue of which a cloud service provider will have some amount of access to the data set. And in this case, there should be a clear demarcation, and the intent should be defined, and how it is being treated has to be defined, either through a service contract or an SLA document, so that at all points of time you clearly know who's the owner of the data, and in case of a conflict, this becomes very important for authorities. Now, the third point that as an end user you have to be very careful about is the data retention period. We have all seen this where a lot of companies at their initial stages will store the information which is sensitive or private by nature on the cloud service providers infrastructure. It can happen that these businesses could run out of operation, and they will need to shut shop. So in such cases, what happens to the data? In majority of these cases, the data just remains on the cloud, where there is no definite control that is established on the data set, and any malicious individual or a hacker who wants to utilize the data for nefarious purposes would be able to do so unless it is protected and safeguarded. And this should be a key concern for cloud users, where they will have to make sure that they define the allowed retention period for which the data can be stored. And post the expiry of such retention period, they should also have a clear mechanism for handling this data. Either it is a deletion or extension of consent if such legal policy demands that the data be held on for longer purposes. But always make sure that clear definition of data retention period is there, and you have a mechanism to address this post the expiry of such mentioned retention period. Now, we have seen what is of interest in terms of countries and regulators wanting to safeguard and protect the data belonging to citizens. We have seen what some of the approaches in the countries have been, how data localization has been adopted as a way to establish this set of controls. We've also seen what kind of challenges cloud service providers and cloud users will have to be cognizant about and handle in their daily operations. Now we will look at one case which happened in our real life world, so that we understand where the data localization versus utilization of cloud resources stands as of today, and how we can bring it to a neutral place through recommendations. In August 2016, a Moscow court ruled that LinkedIn must be blocked in Russia. Now we all know how LinkedIn works. LinkedIn is a platform through which professionals extend and connect with other professionals of similar interest or different interest in the market. There is a lot of filters and mechanisms through which you can reach out to a large number of individuals out there. And as their service offering, you would be able to identify the amount of information that you're given access to. Like as an user of LinkedIn, if you are also registered at LinkedIn, I would probably be able to see which company you work for, under what designation, and what are your interests, and so forth. So this becomes personally identifiable information, and because of this, we will also have to keep in mind that at this point of time, Russia had already implemented its data localization policy. We have seen that Russia said all personal information belonging to citizens will have to be stored within Russia. Now, LinkedIn as a service provider has collected this information, and it is thrown open to any individual who wants to connect with a probable professional contact from Russia. Now that is the business model LinkedIn operates, and the data is also centrally stored in a location from which they have built their business model and their service offerings. So LinkedIn argued in this case, stating that they are not contesting the data localization policy because they are not registered in Russia, number one, and their business model is such that the data is expected to flow freely for them to propagate their business model. But in this case, Russia identified that they want to protect their information at all costs, and this is not an acceptable way in which they can work around the data localization policy that they had at that point of time. So the ban that was imposed on LinkedIn was upheld in November 2016, and LinkedIn stopped its operations in Russia. So here we can see where data with free flow, which propagates a bigger business, is in conflict with a data localization policy. We are going to be looking at how some of the other countries have approached this as well. Now in Dubai International Financial Center and Healthcare City, two entities from UAE, these are entities which process personal data which are collected from its citizens, not only from its citizens, also from expats and foreign nationals who work in the country. Now, this information that they're collecting is sensitive and personal and can easily identify an individual, and because of which they went ahead and established a regulation, a data localization regulation, by virtue of which they are regulating the privacy component and the security controls and the nature of data governance that they've established for this. They have defined a protocol saying this is how they're going to be treating the data and this is how it is going to be protected, along the lines of GDPR, which you have seen in the UK governing the data of UK citizens. Now, there was no definite protocol for how this has to be done, because it was based on GDPR and it was based on a set of best practices from the industry. But this shows a clear indication that privacy and security of information is being treated as of highest importance, and there are a lot of countries who proactively go about and set up these policies to handle this information in a secure fashion, and also have consent included in it wherever there is a data being transferred outside the jurisdiction of the country. Similarly, there are also countries which have adopted data localization who are reviewing their efforts in bringing out a social model where the information that they collect belonging to their citizens can be moved across international borders. Now, the reason is because the business potential for such information being freely available and being able to be used across the globe far outweighs the challenges that are posed, because there is a data localization policy which clearly defines what they expect in terms of regulations and policies, and this will also propagate a positive nature into the market where the information is being available free after the after the adherence to data privacy, and use it for enhancement of their economy. Now we are moving into the last section of the presentation. We are going to be talking about establishing data embassies. It's a three-step recommendation that we go about. The first step would be establishing a central governance council. Now we see that there are a lot of central governance councils for a lot of industries. There are also governance bodies which regulate how a particular vertical or an infrastructure model has to work in the industry. But we do not have a central governance council on the cloud computing platform so far. How we suggest we go about it is there should be regional consortiums that should be set up. Regional consortium could, for example, be set up for SAARC region, APAC region, MENA region, and these would comprise of all the market players and stakeholders in the industry, such as cloud service providers, cloud consumers. We are talking about national regulators, policy makers, governments, industry practitioners, and experts. So when you bring a regional consortium together, what you have essentially done is you've identified all the key challenges and the players in the market, and you can come up with a solution of approach whereby all the regional challenges can be uniformly met by all service providers belonging to different verticals. And when we go a step above that and bring different regional consortiums together, what we go and achieve in that approach is we would be able to create a forum of knowledge transfer and IP repository, which can lay the foundation for all regional consortiums to have one unique way or a common way in which all the major challenges can be addressed. And the primary objective for such a governance council would be to come up with a central data framework which can regulate all the players and how data governance has to be established on a cloud service platform. Now, there is an effort in this side. Further to the G20 summit in 2019, there was the Howard Baker Forum in New America, which convened an expert roundtable in Washington DC on October 3rd. Now, before we get into what they did, we will just set the context of what this forum is all about. This forum was set up mainly to identify the critical and impacting issues for a nation, especially the Americas, and they wanted to understand what kind of impact it possesses and what will be the relation that it will attribute to all the neighboring countries and the trade relations that it has. Now, on this expert roundtable that was convened on October 3rd, the central aim of this body was to chart a path forward in global data governance. They've identified that the cloud platform, which is the future of data storage, processing, and cloud computing, is not regulated by a central data governance, and they wanted to establish a central data governance framework. Now, though there was no clear data governance framework which arose from this effort, what they have been able to achieve was identify the key factors which will be essential to be addressed when you are setting up a data governance framework. So the first step has been what has been achieved from this roundtable, which was convened on October 3rd. Now, with all the key factors being identified and the challenges being identified, now they will be working on the way in which a central governance framework can be established to regulate the market. So that is the next step that we also recommend, the data governance framework. The central framework that is established will have to govern data across all platforms of cloud computing. Now, there should be a clear definition to state the roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities of all the players in the market, whether it is the cloud user or the cloud service provider, whether it is an ancillary service provider who is just offering services or technology solutions on a cloud platform. So once we have a central data governance framework, what happens is you will have a guidelines for acceptable usage and best practices, and it would be effective in regulating the entire market. I will give you an example of how this can help. A lot of you would have come across the standard already. I'm talking about the payment card industry. There is a standard called PCI DSS. It is governed by a central non-profit organization, the PCI SSE Council, and it has gone about and established a framework for regulating the payment flow with respect to cardholder data in the ecosystem. Now, it does not address one single industry. It has come about with a framework which will apply uniformly across all industries, all verticals, all players, and there are contingencies which are accounted for, the differences that a market can throw, and the challenges. So a PCI DSS standard typically regulates the entire payment card industry and is a go-to standard which a lot of our customers also have adopted in order to regulate the way in which privacy and security is addressed for the ecosystem. That is what will be the objective for us through this data governance framework as well. Now we will go again to one case which was done and where we see there is still some amount of challenge. So following the G20 summit in June 2019, Japanese Prime Minister Mr. Shinzo Abe launched the Osaka track. Now this Osaka track was based on the idea of data free flow with trust. And this does not, they did not want the data to be restricted to regional boundaries by data localization because they believe that there is a greater potential which can be leveraged by businesses and countries worldwide by having this concept implemented. Now, the objective of this initiative was to create a framework to promote cross-border data flows while enhancing the protections and safeguards that they have governing the data. Now, there are as we've seen, there are a lot of countries which have supported data localization, and we have seen a lot of countries which has supported data free flow. The same thing has happened here also, where out of the 24 countries which were seated in the G20 summit, countries like United States and China were supporting this policy and they signed it, whereas countries like India, Indonesia, Egypt, and South Africa, we're just naming a few, did not sign it because they believe that they are not fully there in terms of their development and their way of addressing privacy issues with respect to data free flow. Now, this could stem from the fact different countries have different ways in which privacy and security is established in different ways in their own geographic territories. So they wanted a uniform approach, and that is the idea behind the Japanese Prime Minister's suggestion. But these countries believe that the national interest will not be safely protected if they open out to data free flow with trust and without any data localization policy governing the data. Now, how we bring these two ideas together is through the concept called data embassy. This has been around for a few years now. The word data embassy simply means regionally grouped data center having the laws and regulations of the country of data's origin applicable on top of the data set. We will look at a case to understand what this is. In 2007, Estonia fell victim to distributed denial of service attacks. Now we will have to keep in mind that at that point of time, Estonia had moved digitally ahead, where all the citizens' data were uploaded onto the cloud platform, and all of its service offerings were also moved to the cloud platform. Now all the citizens had to do was have their unique registered methodology by which they can use these services. So all of the services had moved digital by that point of time, and this denial of service attack made a number of government and bank websites go offline, and a lot of public sector and communication networks were not operable. So the economy was completely under a huge impact from this attack, and Estonia had to quickly come up with a solution and figure out a way by which such a repeat activity may not bring the economy down. So what they came up with is a bilateral agreement was signed between the country of Estonia and the country of Luxembourg in 2017. They identified a data center in Luxembourg, made sure all the privacy policies, security controls, everything was applied to these data centers to bring it up to standard. And then Estonia moved its citizen sensitive data into the data centers identified in Luxembourg. So what they have achieved by this is they have created a backup wherein if the country is facing an attack, they could always rely on the backup site to come up and provide their services. And what they have also achieved through this bilateral agreement is the jurisdiction for Estonian data, which is stored in Luxembourg, would still rely upon Estonia and not that of Luxembourg. And even the competent and judicial authorities who would be the deciding legal experts for any issue of resolution for the data set would be those identified by the Estonian law and not that of Luxembourg. So what Estonia has successfully done in this scenario is it has made sure that all the control and privacy that it wants and the jurisdiction it wants on the data set is covered, while also making sure that the advantages that a distributed model like cloud platform provides is leveraged to the maximum benefit for business continuity, disaster recovery, backup sites, on-demand services. So all of these advantages Estonia is able to leverage by this initiative. Now, seeing this as an approach, we have seen a lot of adoptions. One such adoption is the cloud law from Kingdom of Bahrain, which was launched in 2018. The legislative decree states that it's very specific to providing cloud computing services to foreign parties. And it's a very nice approach which will help us to bring these conflicting points together. The data stored will be subjected to the domestic law in the foreign state where the relevant consumer resides. This addresses the points of data localization where data jurisdiction and control resides with the home country and not with that of the country where the data is being stored. Similarly, the data will be subject to the jurisdiction of that foreign state's courts and other competent authorities, by virtue of which there is no regional conflict where different local policies will counteract each other, or different geographical policies will not counteract each other by virtue of this. So this gives the advantage where countries can make sure that the control they have applied through data localization is protected, and the cloud users would be free to leverage upon technology enhancements and service enhancements which service providers offer to them from a distributed model. So this is our recommendation, to bring these two concepts together and bring a solution to how the market is going to be for cloud computing. So in summary, data localization is a method identified by countries to establish data privacy and data security for the data that is belonging to their citizens or nationals. They believe it is sensitive and private and confidential in nature, and it has to be protected to safeguard the national interests. So data localization is the way by which regulators and countries and governing bodies protect and safeguard the privacy and the security of the data. Now, cloud service providers and consumers have a role to play, a shared responsibility and accountability when it comes to ensuring the safety and privacy of the data. How we go about it is three-step process, like we have seen. Establish a central governance council. The governance council is to identify all the regional differences and conflicts and come up with a solution so that other regions can share the ideas and have a forum of knowledge through which all differences can be unifiedly approached wherever possible. Then the objective of the governance council would also to be to give out a data governance framework by virtue of which all practitioners and stakeholders in the market will have a central data governance and privacy steps that they can follow and adhere to, thereby bringing the entire industry into some amount of control and have a unified platform. The last step would be to set up a network of data embassies. As we have seen, data embassy is nothing but a data center identified within the legal boundary, and data is being stored there. The country which hosts its data there will hold the jurisdictional authority on top of it, and there will not be any conflict of interest and jurisdictional conflict of interest as well. So there would be a need for increased data governance for cloud computing. Thus, by marrying the concept of data localization policy with data embassy, governments can retain control and can protect and safeguard their national interest, while small businesses, cloud users, and others can leverage the capabilities and the facilities offered by the cloud computing platform, and thus the national interest can be safeguarded, and the future of cloud computing will be leveraged by all the end users who want to make use of these facilities. That brings us to the conclusion of this session. Thank you for your time. We are now open for questions.
We are now open for questions. இப்பதான் வந்தது. Okay, awesome, super man.
சொல்லுங்க, வேற எங்கேயாவது இன்னும் திருப்பி